Or tuned into Recovery TV, the voice of hope, with your host, John J. Tassoni Jr. Discussions and information on addiction and mental health issues. Now, here's John and today's guest.
Welcome to Recovery TV, and I'm your host, John Tassoni. Today, my guest is Miss Meg Klingham, Esquire, and she's the mental health advocate for the state of Rhode Island. A lot of people don't know that we have a mental health advocate. So welcome, Meg.
Thank you, John.
Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Tell my viewers about your job, because a lot of people don't know we have a mental health advocate.
That's true. So my office is a small independent state agency. It's essentially a law firm who serves people living with serious persistent mental illness and various legal situations that they face. So as I say, it's a small agency. It's myself, 3 other lawyers, and our office manager. As I said, we represent people who are involved in the criminal legal system, people who are subject to involuntary psychiatric commitment. We advocate for people's treatment rights. We do a lot of legislative advocacy to try and advocate for funding of the system and to keep an eye on laws that are being passed that might affect our clients one way or the other. And then just a lot of other miscellaneous things. We have a heavy presence at Eleanor Slater Hospital and the new state psychiatric hospital because a lot of our clients are there.
You know, I gotta say, you know, now being the head of the Substance Use Mental Health Leadership Council, your advocacy, your office's advocacy is beyond none. You guys do a great job advocating for the people who have very persistent mental illness. But let's talk a little bit about involuntary commitment.
Okay.
There's been conversations. I think you were with me a few years ago when they tried to pass a piece of legislation that said a parent could override a child's, actually an adult child's, way of getting substance use mental health treatment. And that was a very telling conversation because you get that call, you get those calls all the time. Matter of fact, I got one Sunday morning after someone watched the show on a Saturday night. She was beyond belief that I couldn't help her because her son was 30 years old and she was in her early 70s, pertaining to an issue where he was in Butler. She didn't want him to get out because he needed more treatment than 4 or 5 days at Butler. So give me a day, Meg, of the mental health advocate and what you do during the course of the day. Obviously I know what you do, but my viewers don't.
Well, every day is different, as you could imagine. That's a lot of what I do, honestly, is speaking to people like that parent that you spoke with yesterday, explaining Rhode Island's mental health law. A couple of things. Rhode Island's mental health law does not permit, or we don't have any law in Rhode Island that permits involuntary commitment for substance use disorder or for intoxication. It's solely for psychiatric conditions. And it's a pretty high bar in Rhode Island because when the law was enacted, it was back when there was rampant abuse and people were being deinstitutionalized. Back when the law was passed, we had a pretty decent system of outpatient services for people living with mental disabilities. So there's pretty high due process standards before a person's liberty can be taken away from them. So back to your original question, I get a lot of calls from parents or family members who are very frustrated with the system and the fact that you can't involuntarily, you know, a parent or anybody can't just involuntarily commit somebody. So what I do, I talk to a lot of people, try to educate. I also try to advocate. I try to look into it. So if there's a patient that's at the hospital and they're going to be discharged prematurely, which often happens, I try to advocate with the State Department of Behavioral Health, BHDDH. There's people over there that have oversight of the hospital psychiatric units, so I try to work with them to ensure that the person's getting the treatment that they need and they're not being discharged prematurely. Every day I get several phone calls from people who are either in an emergency department, and I get calls from people who are subject to the hospitalization as well saying, I'm in the emergency department right now, I'm having these issues, and they're telling me they're not going to admit me to the hospital. People who are crying out for help who aren't able to get the treatment that they need. So I spend a lot of time kind of nagging people and negotiating for better outcomes for people.
Right.
Fridays are mental health court day, so Fridays are the day that all of the hearings are heard in the district court. They have a mental health court calendar, so that's a very busy day just being in court. On any given day, I'm out at any of the, and my staff are out at any of the hospitals throughout the state, from Woonsocket to Westerly. And as I said, I have taken a particular interest and made it my mission to kind of try and protect the rights of people who are at Eleanor Slater Hospital and the new forensic hospital.
I know you're going to think this is a crazy question, but is it getting worse?
Yes, it's absolutely getting worse. And also on my campus, so my office is on the campus where Eleanor Slater Hospital is, the Pastore complex, and that's also where the prison is. And it's been getting progressively worse. In the prison, as you know, you've heard me say, and you've said yourself, it's currently our largest state psychiatric hospital, basically, but it's not a hospital, and it can't treat people. And I think just because of the lack of an array of services in the community, a lot of people find themselves involved in the criminal legal system, not because they're doing anything willfully wrong, but because of symptoms of their illness, untreated, end them up in various predicaments. So I also, we're over at the ACI, and we're trying to work with people who need treatment who are at the ACI, either trying to advocate for them getting out of the ACI for outpatient treatment or over to the hospital where they belong.
Meg, do you think prior to COVID, it wasn't as busy as it is today? Or did COVID exacerbate the problem?
You know, I hear a lot of people say that COVID really exacerbated, and it did, in the fact that healthcare workers are burnt out, we've lost a lot of people in the field, that kind of thing. But I think that our system was falling apart long before COVID, and I think that things were just as dire for my particular client population prior to COVID.
Why do you think that?
I think...
is the illness getting worse? Is the mental health illness getting worse, or is it the access to care?
It's the access to care, I think. I mean, I'm just a lawyer. I'm not a clinician or a doctor, so... But
what do you mean you're just a lawyer?
But I think that it's the access to treatment.
Yeah.
I've been around for 30 years. I started my career as a public defender 30 years ago. And during my tenure there, I had a lot of clients who were struggling with these issues. But not as many incarcerated. There were more services that we could funnel people to help stabilize people and keep them out in the community and in their homes. Things have just, over the last 20 years, I would say 20, what do you think, about 20 years have just really fallen precipitously as far as access to treatment, as far as the community mental health centers being reimbursed enough to be able to keep staff and to recruit new staff and to provide the array of services that are needed. So I think it's gotten worse, but I don't think COVID, I think things were going downhill before COVID. It certainly, it made things more difficult. But
Right. You know, there's been a lot of conversation about keeping people into treatment for a longer period of time. But I want to talk more about that when we come back, because the length of stay in both substance use and mental health, I don't believe, and you may disagree with me, is adequate enough. So we're going to take a break so I can pay the bills. You're watching Recovery TV, and I'm your host, Sean Tassoni. See you right after these messages.
Now, back to Recovery TV with your host, John J. Tassoni Jr. Recovery TV is made possible by our supporting sponsors and our title sponsor, AdCare. Now, here's John and today's guest.
Welcome back to Recovery TV, and I'm your host, Sean Tassoni. Miss Meg Klingham, Esquire, is in the house today, talking about mental health issues, and Meg is the mental health advocate. If you didn't know, my viewers, here she is. So welcome, Meg, and thank you for joining us today. You know, there's been a lot of talk about mental health lately, a lot of money coming into the system, both federally and statewide. Your office, you said you had yourself and 3 other attorneys and an office manager.
Yes.
Could you use more help?
We could always use more help, and hopefully we'll be bringing a social worker on staff soon, which I've been advocating for years, so I think that will help significantly. But really, we could do so much more for our clients if there were services to get them into.
Right.
The biggest frustration is that people want help, but they're not able to get it because they just don't have access to it. This might be a little off subject, but I got a letter from a gentleman who's at the ACI right now, and he's had a long and storied history, mostly of drug offenses, and he's begging me, please, I want help. I've been sober now that I've been here. I've gotten treatment while I'm at the ACI, but I'm going to be released to homelessness, and then I'm going to fall back. And it's so infuriating to me that somebody is finally able to realize that they need help and begging for help, and it's just not necessarily going to be out there for them. So yes, we could always use more help in our office, but I would prefer to have the system kind of be more able to be responsive to people who need the help.
You know, the system, when I was first in the General Assembly back in 2000, we were #1 in the country. Now we're like number 48. You know, the system has made a total 360 flip. Yep. And now, more than ever, the system needs to be pumped up with some air and get it floating again, because there's a lot of people screaming for help. Children screaming for help.
Yep.
Adults screaming for help. And now we're getting a lot more elderly screaming for help.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the children. Does your office represent children?
We do. We represent children who are subject to involuntary commitment at a psychiatric hospital or psychiatric unit. One of the unique things about Rhode Island law, as I said, it's all about protecting people's liberty interests. So under Rhode Island law, a child cannot be admitted to a psychiatric unit without the child consenting to it. So in other words, both the parent and the child have to consent to the treatment. So say if a parent wants to put their kid at Bradley, Bradley accepts the child, but the child refuses to go voluntarily, then that triggers the mental health law and the civil court certification process. So we represent the children in those situations.
So you're basically the eyes and ears of that child.
Well, no, we're their defense lawyer.
Okay.
It's not a best interest standard.
Okay.
We don't represent their best interest. We represent their liberty interest.
Okay.
So we represent the child. A little bit about the civil court certification process. It's a process whereby a doctor has to petition the court. The cases are kind of prosecuted, I use that word loosely, but kind of presented by BHDDH, Department of Behavioral Health Legal Counsel. They represent the doctor, who's the petitioner, and the doctor has to come to court and testify why this person needs this treatment. They have to prove that the person, by reason of a psychiatric disability, is in need of care and treatment, and is not able to or refuses to accept that treatment voluntarily, and that there are no less restrictive alternatives, such as home-based care or group home or something, that they need that level of treatment. So back to the kids' question, a parent could, with all the best intentions, say my child needs help and try to put them in the hospital, but if the child's refusing, then they have a hearing.
It must be frustrating on your part when you know the certain particulars on a case and you can't get the child what they need because services are so weak, and I use that word, in Rhode Island. So someone who's a mom, as you are, and people don't know this, but we've gone back about 50 years, me and you, growing up. But it's got to be tough when you go home at night and saying, you know, did I do the right thing for this child? That, you know, hopefully he or she gets the treatment she needs so they can find their way back into a normal situation. Do you have times like that you really scratch your head and like, geez, did I do the right thing?
Every day, or more likely every night when I wake up at 2 in the morning and
Yeah.
just go over and over all of that, of course.
Yeah, well, I'm sure the whole office is like that. And again, I mean, I talk to student assistance counselors all the time, and there's a lot of problems. There's a lot of problems. No matter if it's Central Falls, Smithfield, Burrillville, you know, Gloucester, Coventry. There's a lot of problems with our children today.
There are, and there's so many. You had asked me before if I think that COVID exacerbated the problems, and I said not the system was in disarray before that. I have noticed that we have a lot more kids who are coming before the mental health court, a lot more children in crisis than we had before. And I think that's a number of reasons. I think the disruption in school was very, of course, difficult for kids. I think that school is a place where maybe there are adults who might recognize signs of an issue and maybe could, I don't want to say nip it in the bud, but get people help when they need it.
Right.
And that was disrupted, as we know, for 2 years. I think a lot of the social media, I think is very, very difficult for children and just adds an extra layer on to what they have to deal with. So,
do you also think that the issue of substance use now, how liquid it is in the communities, is causing a problem, and now we got legalization of marijuana now? Do you think that is encompassed in some of the problems that we're having?
Sure. A lot of my clients have dual diagnoses, and a lot of people have issues with both substance use and psychiatric issues, and they're kind of intermingled. So it's hard to talk about them as separate issues because they're really not.
Right. What about alcohol? Are you seeing a lot of kids with alcohol issues? And
I've not.
Right.
I've not. The kids that we see are mostly very severely psychiatrically ill at the time that we see them. So that's not generally a factor in the cases I see. But again, we only see cases that rise to the highest level of treatment needs.
Now, do you work also with DCYF?
No.
No. Okay.
Some of our kids are in DCYF custody, so yes, if they instead of being in their parents' custody, if they're in DCYF custody, then yes, we deal with DCYF on that front.
All right, we're going to take another quick break. Okay. You're watching Recovery TV, and I'm your host, Sean Tassoni. Meg Klingham, Esquire, has been my guest. We'll be right back after these messages.
And now, back to Recovery TV with your host, John J. Tassoni Jr. Recovery TV is made possible by our supporting sponsors and our title sponsor, AdCare. Now, here's John and today's guest.
Welcome back to Recovery TV, and I'm your host, John Tassoni. Meg Klingham is in the house today. Meg is the attorney for the Mental Health Association. Actually, she's the advocate for mental health in the state of Rhode Island. So, Meg, welcome, and thank you for joining us today, and thank you for the work that you do. And if anyone has an issue and needs to talk to Meg, you can call Meg at 462-2003. So, Meg, I want to talk a little bit about housing. Been hitting the news all over the place about people sleeping different locations. Eviction notices been given out. Where are these people supposed to go?
Good question, John. One of the things that I don't think I mentioned that my office is pretty heavily involved in is housing retention. So we handle a lot of eviction cases for our clients who, for whatever reason, are subject to being evicted. Either it's because of untreated symptoms of their illness, or because of poverty, or for a myriad of reasons. And it's terrible. And then you get evicted and you become homeless. That happens in the blink of an eye for people, and it's devastating. And on my soapbox, but there is no reason in the richest country in the world that we should have people sleeping in tents outside the State House, or sleeping on the streets, or encampments by the side of the highway. So I think housing, without housing, is very, very hard to maintain your health.
Right.
Physical, mental, sobriety. So I think that's the number one issue that.
And we have folks coming out of the ACI being released 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. Where do they go? Harrington Hall? And Harrington Hall is full? It
is. And you also, you don't just walk to a shelter and get a bed. There are protocols. You have to be on a list. They have to apply beforehand, and they open at, say, 5 or 6 o'clock, and then you have to leave during the day. So shelters, we need shelters, and the people that run them are wonderful and all, but there's this misconception sometimes that we'll just go stay in a shelter, and it's not that easy. It's not an easy system to navigate, and it's not a permanent solution, as we know.
Well, that's the key. I mean, homelessness was one of my key issues when I was in the General Assembly. Got the first of its kind in the country, the Homeless Bill of Rights. That you'll be seeing more and more information coming about that. Now that we have these shelters, that law should be posted on every facility, shelters that these people are staying in for the next 6 to 8 months, so they know their rights. I'm hearing horror stories going on in the shelters. We got to have more training for the individuals that run the shelters.
Absolutely.
We have more training for the people that are working in the shelters, and you know, we need to expand on this housing issue, because if not, it's not going to get any better.
And we need more support for the people who are utilizing the shelters.
Right.
More support for kind of wraparound services. They don't just need a cot to sleep on. There's a lot of services that people
Right.
need.
Meg, I want to thank you for coming on today. If you need Meg, 462-2003, The Advocate, right here. You've been watching Recovery TV, and I'm your host, John Tassoni. See you next week.